Please silence your mobile devices. Our program will be beginning shortly.
For many people, today's world is insecure, full of threats on many fronts. Violent conflicts, natural disasters, persistent poverty, epidemics and economic downturns endanger peace, stability, and sustainable development. These threats are no longer isolated events limited to national borders. Their destruction travels the globe with great consequences on all societies. We cannot face these insecurities alone. We need to rise above our national and individual differences as one human family, with human security for all. Human security is a people-centered view of what it means to be safe and secure. Faced with unprecedented challenges, the world requires urgent responses and innovative solutions. Next generation and human-centered technology carry the potential to reshape our future. Join us on a mission to bring human security for all through technology. Let us rise together to reach our potential and leave no one behind.
Please join us in welcoming our session panelists to the stage.
Hey everyone, welcome to this panel, Using Tech to Create a Sustainable Food Supply. My name is Michael Wolf, I'll be your moderator today. I run a publication called The Spoon where we write about food technology and innovation. And I couldn't be more excited to be on stage with this esteemed panel that we have today, where we're talking about really important issues. And I think you're probably all agree that the pandemic and more recently the war in Ukraine really laid bare how fragile our food supply is. The reality is our current food production system really rests on a foundation of fossil fuel and a lot of things that basically contribute to climate change and acidification and lack of biodiversity. And so that's one of the problems. Add into the fact that, despite the fact the food system that we have today produces more than enough calories to probably feed everyone on Earth, billions of people go hungry every day and are in persistent food security. So what I do want to spend some time today is talking about how technology and innovation can address those issues. And we have three great and different perspectives to do that. To get started, I'd like to maybe jump in and have each of you talk a little bit about yourself. So Chantalyn, I want to start with you and just ask you a little bit, tell us a little bit about your organization's role and how it addresses human food insecurity.
Thank you so much, Michael, and good afternoon. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm here wearing two hats, the UN hat, of course, where we're seeing, as Michael has said, I think numbers, when we get to the billions, we get lost somehow, but 2.4 billion is the number of people that are malnourished or in food insecurity right now. That's the number of people that were on the planet, total number of people after World War II. That's how many people are food insecure right now. That's a lot of people. And so the question is, what do we do about it? And so there's a few things that the UN is doing. One is in 2015, you might know that the UN, there are 193 members of the United Nations, including this country and all the countries that you represent, have adopted the Sustainable Development Goals. So SDG 2, Sustainable Development Goal 2, is about nutritious food for all and sustainable agriculture. Now, the question is, are we doing good? Answer, no. We're actually going backward. After the pandemic, we actually saw a decrease in investment in food production. Now it's a bit going up because of the crisis in Ukraine. Why? Because a lot of countries, including 38 developing countries, realized that they were 50% and up dependent on 2 countries for their grain and their food security, at the same time that their currency was devaluating. So that's one thing, we're addressing this issue. And getting to the Global Crisis Response Group, getting the grain out of Ukraine, Russia, and fertilizers out of Russia to ensure that we could actually have enough food and depress price so people can afford those food. The second thing that we do, last year we had a food summit that looked at the concept of not just production of food, but how nutritious is the food once it gets to your table, and this concept of One Health. Because if you eat a lot of food, but it's not nutritious, you have obesity, you have other issues, and you have health issues, so the One Health issues and the impact of the food production on our planet. So that's 2. Third one is we have a Human Security for All campaign. And here, this is where I represent the World Academy of Art and Science. You will have noticed when you registered that the CES this year, the theme is Human Security for All. And the whole idea, and one of the 7 dimensions of human security is food security. Because these are all interrelated. You can't have health security if you don't have food security. And that means, and you can all probably are not productive, so you may not have economic security. So all these things are really related. So these are, in a nutshell, the things that we're doing.
Great, thank you very much. Next up we have Dave Friedberg, who is the CEO of the Production Board. Dave, you've been involved in ag and food tech innovation for some time now. I know that we had a little bit of a conversation yesterday, and your primary vehicle for affecting change is your company, the Production Board. I'd like to maybe just start and give everyone a little bit of background on what you've done and how you got to where you are and what the Production Board does.
I started a company in 2006 called the Climate Corporation that was acquired in 2013. It's become kind of the predominant software platform used by farmers around the world to make decisions, used on 180 million acres globally. And the Production Board is an investment firm. We start businesses and we make investments at what I would generally call kind of the intersection of digital and biology, with a heavy focus on agriculture, food, and solutions that can resolve a lot of the challenges that I think are becoming more apparent and more concerning. We work in kind of synthetic biology as one area where you can kind of produce proteins without the animals. We work in agriculture technologies where there's tools like metagenomics and understanding soil microbiome and how can we harness and resolve outcomes from the soil microbiome. And then more interestingly now, the engineering of genomes. So historically, plant breeding and tools like that were done using kind of ad hoc methods and what's called phenotyping, where you look at the plants that are growing the biggest, and those are the ones you continue to take seed from, and over time yields go up. Now we can actually look at the genome of those plants, and using software and sequencing tools, and now these gene editing tools that emerged about 10 years ago, we can actually go in and change the genome in a very specific way to accelerate breeding. And as a result, accelerate yield and add things like vitamins and other kind of nutrients into plants. So there's an emerging area that's happening in agriculture right now where we're harnessing what I would argue is kind of this massive revolution enabled by digital tools to change the biology and accelerate things that historically have been kind of haphazard, ad hoc, and long range. So that's the set of things that we invest in. We start businesses, we make investments, and then another key theme which we can talk about is also this idea of distributing production. So rather than making everything centrally, can we have things that we could generally call food printers at the edge of the network where we can kind of make things in a more local place versus having everything go to a factory and make the same thing for everyone. And the carbon footprint and the efficiency of those systems are kind of outdated now. They're about 100 years old. So new technologies in automation, software are allowing us to kind of move food production out to the edge of the network. And there's a lot of investments that are happening in that space. Great,
thanks for that. Next up, we have Barbara Humpton, who is the CEO of Siemens. I don't think Siemens really needs an introduction. You're the CEO of Siemens USA. I mean, it's a massive company. It's certainly well known around the world. But maybe you could spend just a little bit of time telling us about how your company touches the food system. And
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, there are a lot of people who ask first, why is Siemens at CES? You're not a consumer-based company. But it turns out that, this whole topic is one that touches all consumers. We are a tech company. I'm so glad you called on me third because I think we can tie this together. The technology that Siemens is focused on is the electrification, the automation, the digitalization that has been transforming the backbones of economies for 175 years now. And because of the technology available to us today, we can now turn these tools to sustainable food production. Technology with purpose. And so I think about the work of our team in Siemens Financial Services. Some time ago, they were searching for companies to invest in. So David, much like you have chosen to enable companies who are introducing new technologies, we want to make our investments in these areas as well, supporting the Sustainable Development Goals. And our team found 80 acres. So out in Hamilton, Ohio, there's a couple of entrepreneurs who have put up, in essence, a vertical farm, 80 acres. They can produce in their 1 acre what it would take 80 acres to produce otherwise. And what we discovered is that not only was this a great investment, but this is a perfect application of technology. Because what does it take to grow nutritious food? It takes controlled conditions. And so now the automation technology that we've been using in factory environments can actually be used in a growing house and can help produce some of the most nutritious, some of the tastiest produce that you could imagine. It can be done close to the source of need, meaning we could be bringing vertical farming into light industrial areas, in food deserts in cities across the country. And so these two entrepreneurs have been developing their methodology. They've been experimenting and doing research and have now realized that they can actually be engineering foods as medicine. So we're right on the front end of this. If you come to the Siemens booth, you'll have a chance to meet Tisha Livingston and Mike Zelkind, the co-founders of 80 Acres, and you can see, I get a little glimpse of the kind of technology that we've put into their process.
Awesome. And you guys made an announcement today. That's super exciting.
Yeah, thank you.
In the food world, it's simultaneously very exciting because there's just, we're at a time in the world where there's so many leaps forward in amazing technologies like synthetic biology that can really help us reinvent and rethink food systems. But like I said, simultaneously, we're seeing how fragile our food system, how brittle they are. So, Chantalyn, I want to maybe ask you, what are the current issues in 2023, where we sit today, that really need to be addressed most urgently with innovation? What are some areas you think?
Well, let me start by responding, because it's very interesting. Everything you've been talking about depends on data and having access. We're talking about replacing input by information, right? Which is a good thing because we want to reduce our footprint on the planet. The problem is 50% of the planet is not connected. And so we need to solve that problem, or we are at risk of leaving 50% of the population behind. And that means that there's no human security for those people, but we can't kid ourselves. It means there's no human security for any one of us. Because when we can't feed our family, there's social unrest, there's polarization, there's lack of democracy. These democracies are even more at risk. So we're all in the same deal here. So the one thing that we're working on is ensuring, so UNCTAD basically help developing countries take advantage of trade, but that requires investment and that requires technology. How do we ensure that these technologies that you're talking about, and then increasingly, I'm so excited that CES is having this as a team now, because it's just now the technology is getting affordable enough that these countries, if we have the right investment and finance structure, that we can get there. So what do we try to do at the UN, and especially at UNCTAD, is working on public investment. So basically, developing countries have underinvested in their agriculture, and that means there's very little investment. That's why there's an increasing number of net food importing countries. That's not good, because we saw what happened when we depend on 1 or 2 countries for our food, or anything else for that matter. The second thing is increasing the public investment. Then it's using the multilateral development banks and the national development banks to ensure that we have that public money that support the beginning of bringing these technologies, putting in place the infrastructure, not choosing the winners, but putting the infrastructure. And nowadays, when we talk about infrastructure, it's no longer just the port and the roads, but it's the digital. It's access to the digital and the data. And how do we ensure that developing countries keep ownership of their data? It doesn't just go back to the big companies, but that they actually can keep and innovate, because the innovation is going to come from the data and mining that data. So these are the things that I think, the UN, and it was funny, somebody mentioned earlier that the UN doesn't seem to be open to technologies or technologists. And I hope it's not true. At UNCTAD, actually, we have a Commission on Science and Technology for Development. And our role there is to help developing countries to develop their system of national innovation. And we're focusing, of course, on 2 big areas that will not surprise anybody: renewables and agriculture. And of course, so having the right and the entrepreneurial system to do that. But in my mind, what we're going to need is these joint venture, because you may not have the knowledge of the market and the institution in these markets, and these are the growth market, right? But they do, but they don't have the capital, the technology, they don't have, especially now, what we're concerned about is the innovation you're talking about, David and Barbara. It's not one patent. It's a series of patents. So it's really hard for developing countries to have access to all of them technically, but also economically. So how do we ensure that we have process in place to help them? And this is where the role of the UN or international organization and the World Academy of Art and Science in terms of, but also the partnership with CTA to try to address these issues. So we have a common goal, which is achieving the SDGs, and how do we have all the key stakeholders come together to ensure we don't leave 3 billion people behind?
Yeah. Dave, judging by your work, I think you probably wouldn't argue that you believe that technology can really impact and change the food system. I think you spent a lot of your career working on that. Can you spend a little bit of time explaining some of the technologies that you're excited about today, that the production board and you are identifying, or you have investments in, that you think can make an impact?
Sure. So I'll do 2 sections in agriculture and maybe 2 sections outside of agriculture. Within agriculture, there's kind of one big trend, which is the digitization of agriculture. So this started 15 years ago, where embedded sensors and wireless connectivity became fairly ubiquitous. When I went out with Climate Corp, I started the company in 2006. In 2008, 3G networks reached into rural areas in the Midwest and the Corn Belt, and farmers got online for the first time because they got cell phones at Burger King. Burger King had this cell phone giveaway. And a lot of farmers, funny enough, ended up using the internet for the first time, and they weren't knowledge workers, so they didn't have desktop computers, they weren't using tools that way. And I think that's what we see today around the world. Brazil's another great example where there's now wireless connectivity throughout that region. Farmers are now getting online, sensors are now available to measure outcomes, and every piece of farm equipment that comes off the line now has digital wirelessly connected sensors. I know John May from John Deere was here earlier today speaking about this. So digitization in agriculture then allows us to model and predict outcomes and then make software-driven recommendations to farmers about what to do. They then implement it. The automated equipment can run it for them in the field, and yields go up. And when I say yields go up, I mean the amount of calories produced per acre divided by the amount of water, the amount of land, the amount of carbon, the amount of dollars, everything improves. Productivity overall improves. So that's happening broadly, and there's a huge gap to fill. In the US, the average corn farmer gets 175 bushels an acre. In Brazil, they're getting about, or China's a good example, they're getting about 110. Kenya, they get about 70 bushels an acre. And they're the same land, same climate, same soil. Huge opportunity to improve productivity using software and digital tools. Then there's this genome engineering work that's happening. Historically, we had no idea what the genomic sequence was of the plant or the microbes in the soil that it turns out are really effective in changing the condition of the growing environment and driving outcomes. DNA sequencing 20 years ago, cost $100 million and many months or years to sequence the human genome. Today, we can do that for $100. And anyone can get a DNA sequencer, put it in their home, and actually run these tests. You have to watch some YouTube videos to do it. Really cool opportunity for anyone else that's kind of a geek and wants to try it out. And so DNA sequencing has followed faster than Moore's law in terms of cost reduction for a variety of reasons related to how the technology works. As a result, we're seeing the biological data that we never saw before. We can see what genes are being expressed, what genes are driving what outcomes in the farm, and what genes in the soil are driving what outcomes in the field. And now we're harnessing that capability. So we're actually using that genomic data to drive plant breeding, that genomic data to actually engineer plants, not using GMOs or non-native DNA, but actually changing the native DNA of the plant, turning genes on and off to change outcomes on that plant and selling new seed that does amazing things, and engineering the soil microbiome. And so it's not just the microbes that are in the soil, but we can now engineer and create new microbes, for example, that can replace fertilizer, sucking up nitrogen from the atmosphere and replacing 6% of global energy use, which is used to make ammonia, or fixing phosphorus or potassium to the plants. Massive reduction in cost, massive reduction in carbon footprint, massive reduction in the environmental cost generally of farming. So that's kind of what's happening in agriculture. And then outside of ag, I would say one of the key areas of investment, which we talked about as synthetic biology, is this idea that you can engineer microbes and turn microbes into factories to make stuff for you. So using the same genomic engineering principles that I just highlighted, you can actually take the DNA of a microbe, put foreign DNA in it, like the DNA to make chicken eggs or cow's milk. That microbe, which is like a yeast cell, you put in a fermenter tank, feed it sugar water like you would make wine, and it can actually print out cow's milk, print out chicken egg proteins, and so on. So synthetic biology is this massive kind of wave right now of investment, and it's facing a ton of economic hurdle problems, which I'm happy to talk about, but it is absolutely a replacement for what is roughly 8.5 billion acres of land, which is how we make a lot of the proteins that we use on planet Earth. And so this is a huge investment area. And then the fourth one I would say is this idea of using distributed production systems through automation and software. So, you know, a whole factory can be reduced down to a printer that you can put in your home that can print a beverage or can, you know, print something that you want to consume. And rather than transport all of the molecules back and forth across this massive inefficient supply chain, which is really kind of left over from the first and second industrial revolutions, carbon intensive, inefficient, we're rewriting those systems using local printers that can just take the core molecules that are needed to make food, print out the food, and there's a lot of different iterations of that, including vertical farming and so on. So those are the big investment trends that I think are transformative, each one of which has 10 to 100x productivity improvement potential. As a result, I'm highly optimistic. Food will get more available, it will get cheaper, carbon and land, water use will all reduce significantly over the decades ahead. And you know, the only challenge right now is the economic hurdles. Getting to price points on all of these outcomes that beat commodity prices so that the actual consumer market demands and pulls it, as opposed to venture capitalists and, you know, optimistic capitalists trying to push it, which is kind of the big tension in the markets right now.
On the distributed manufacturing side, this idea like Canna, where you basically move from a centralized factory that's highly efficient, producing lots of calories and nutrition in whatever way, versus pushing it to the endpoints into our homes. Ultimately, does that work in developing countries? Can talk about your thoughts on that. How does that work in sub-Saharan Africa or in Latin America, where they're, you know, they don't have they may have like $10.
You asking me?
Yeah, I'm asking you in particular.
Yeah, so yes, let me use beverages as an example. Global beverages are about a $2 trillion market. That's how much we spend on bottled and canned soda, juice, coffee, tea, wine, beer, liquor. It's about a half wine and beer, $1 trillion wine and beer. Can you believe it? I believe it. And half like, coffee, tea, juice, and soda. 99% of a beverage is water. Maybe there's some ethanol and some sugar. And only 1% is the molecules that differentiates that beverage into wine, juice, milk, coffee, tea, soda, whatever. So all we need to do is distribute that 1%. Instead, we're growing trees and harvesting plants and doing all this inefficient work and spending 40 liters of water to make a liter of OJ, or 600 liters of water to make a liter of wine, and a couple hundred million acres, about 200 million acres used to make beverage ingredients today. And so yes, if you can get these machines cheap enough, you can get them in the home, I think you can unlock kind of a massive supply chain value creator, which not only is more interesting and offers people more personalized choice, which by the way is what all technology does, right? We used to have a mainframe in a basement, cost $16 million. Now we all have a computer in our pocket and it does whatever we want to do. It's cheaper, it's faster, it's smaller, and it's personalized. I think we see the same with food and other production systems, where they move to these more smaller modular form factors in our home. They're cheaper, they're faster, and they give us more of what we want versus what is kind of mass produced for a mass consumer market. And that's really this interesting evolution towards personalization, which also drives consumer demand.
Maybe just to, oops, sorry.
It's possible. This is all possible, right? But I want to come back to the comment that Chantalyn made at the beginning. You need power.
Exactly. Yes, I'm about to
Comms.
say.
You need power and you need comms. And I'm looking out at this room full of people and thinking, there are folks out there who understand the critical pieces of this that yet need to be built. What David's describing, we see happening in many segments. Here's the trend. Move data, not stuff. Right? Move data, not stuff. Now think of everything moving to the edge. And think about distributed manufacturing, think about distributed food production. We have the component pieces. Now we need to figure out how to get over the economic curve to get it there. At Siemens, we've been working on the concept of the digital twin. So the idea that anything we might want to make can be described in a virtual model. And we can actually distribute those virtual models and we can allow the manufacture of those wherever they're needed. Same thing with recipes for food production, et cetera. And so this has been what's so exciting, and I'll pitch 80 Acres again. Come see what they've done, because what they've been able to do is cut out a very long logistics portion of the supply chain and enable the production of food very close to the point of consumption. What that does for our sustainability objectives is powerful.
Chantalyn, did you have something you wanted to respond to?
No, that was exactly
Okay,
right. We need electricity for all this to happen.
We need electricity.
And there's still, and reliable, affordable electricity. And again, I'm not saying this is your problem. This is what we need to solve for you to be able to bring that technology to those countries. And this is why none of us can solve that problem alone. So we need these partnerships to make this happen.
Indeed.
We've heard about some of the exciting changes that are coming down the pike. But when I look at how we get those into market over time, there's a lot of forces pushing back against that, including entrenched interests, incumbents. When I look at for example, Culture Meat, I mean, the Cattlemen's Association and lobbies like that are actively putting out either misinformation or information that tries to get people to say this is a bad idea, right? So there's a lot of entrenched interests that I think push back against change with regards to the food system, even as things worsen over time. So, I mean, I'd like any one of you to talk about how do we fight back against these calcified forces that are resistant to change when there's an urgency towards change?
So one quick one, let's let the market do it. Right, we've seen market segment after market segment get disrupted through digital transformation. This is happening in agriculture. And so there are going to be people who are going to resist and try to hang on to things. But the fact is, if it's good for us, if it makes economic sense, the market is going to demand it. And I'm optimistic this is moving.
Yeah, I agree completely. It's a Luddite argument, right? These guys are Luddites. They're anti-tech because it's going to hurt them. Good luck. But the problem is, if we don't make meat that's cheaper than meat today, you can't win in the market. I tell people this a lot, and this is a UN estimate. By the end of 2100, the end of the century, 90% of the world's population will live in Africa and South Asia. And that population is moving up the economic ladder, right? Just like we saw in China where the GDP per capita went from 6,000 to 30,000 and meat consumption climbed. As the market as the market earns more, they demand a better lifestyle, they demand more protein, they demand these food sources, and they go to the cheapest source possible. If the cheapest source possible is beef from the Cattlemen's Association, that's what they're gonna pick. Or the hogs from the Chinese hog production system, that's what they're gonna pick. If we can invent through technology, which physics says we can and we should be able to, an alternative that is fundamentally cheaper, then they will choose that. That's the breakthrough that's needed for this to happen. It will happen. It is gonna be very expensive. There's gonna be a ton of failures. A ton of money will be blown up in the process. But over the next couple of decades, I'm highly confident that just first principles physics says this will happen. We don't need the whole friggin' animal, right? We can grow that protein without growing the whole cow. Cows walk around, they make heat. They use a lot of water. They're pretty inefficient, actually, in making meat. So, we can engineer other systems to make that meat. And as that happens, the market will choose that cheaper alternative, and the Luddites will need to transform into something else. And by the way, I can't talk about this, but we will start to see this over the next couple of weeks. There will be some announcements of some of these older industries making this transformation. We already see companies like Tyson making bets on these businesses in synthetic biology because they see the writing on the wall. They know this is happening. And so whether you're a dairy producer or a cattle producer, you're starting to realize, if you're smart and sophisticated, that you should start to make the bets. And all the nonsense marketing will eventually be drowned out by economic reality as these things do get cheaper. But we have to get them cheaper.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I just, I think one thing that David, that you mentioned is important is that, I'm an ag and environmental economist.
Yeah.
So when I went to school, GMO was basically you shoot randomly these genes and you hope they're going to end up in the right spot. And we've evolved significantly from that, as you said earlier.
Yeah.
And I think there is still that belief in the market. We haven't informed consumers about, because technology moves so quickly. I don't think consumers can keep up. And so, but again, I think there will be a backlash if we do not inform, be transparent about these things, and ensure that we bring the whole of the population with us.
Yeah, I mean, so 10 years ago, you guys may have heard of this term CRISPR-Cas9, this enzyme that allows us to engineer the genome specifically at a particular point, make specific changes. And since that point, there are now hundreds of alternatives to CRISPR-Cas9, and the tooling needed and the infrastructure needed has dropped in cost and become much more available. So there are thousands of labs around the world now that are using CRISPR-Cas9 to write the software of life, to write genomic code. And as a lot of software people in this world in this room might know, I'm sure a lot of your friends are now looking at moving over to bioengineering because it is the next kind of software platform, and you can actually engineer things in the physical world by changing this genomic code. It's scary, right? And it has been scary, and it's been like, how the heck can we change life? It's evil. Oh my gosh, we're going to kill ourselves. I worked at Monsanto when my company was bought, so I've heard the Death Star arguments, and I'm like Darth Vader's evil offspring now. But when you get into the scientific understanding of it, it's like, holy shit, this really is an incredible set of tools like we've always had. We've always evolved our tooling. And now we can see this transformation happen. So Europe, the EU, basically said any gene editing is not allowed in agricultural products, and we can't do this without GMO approval. In March of last year, the European Court of Justice came out and said, you know what, we were wrong. Because what we're seeing is that these specific gene editing tools are absolutely transforming farmers' yield potential and the environmental and sustainability benefits available in agriculture around the world, and European farmers are being left out. They've overturned that, and now non-GMO, which means you're not bringing in non-native DNA into the organism, but just changing the genome of an organism around and editing it to turn stuff on and off, is going to be allowed and is going to become mainstay. And it is already being done and rewriting kind of a lot of agriculture. So this is happening as the understanding kind of leaches out. Kenya, Nigeria, these African nations are starting to reverse course on their gene editing bans. So it is a matter of time, but we have a lot of education and understanding to get through.
Great. Change is expensive. And what I like about this panel is we have three different kind of perspectives in terms of like, I think it's going to take a long-term investment horizon and a patient investment horizon. But at the same time, we see all these economic headwinds that if you look at the venture investment market today, there's a lot of kind of pullback and kind of worry. So I'd kind of like to hear maybe from each of you in terms of how do we continue to raise money? We're going to need money with all stakeholders at the table, governments, NGOs, private capital, venture capital. How do we continue to get the necessary investment to turn into investment, capital to turn into investment to change the food system? Chantalyn?
I guess one of the things that we're seeing is financialization of the market, right? And so increasingly, you have a decoupling of the financial market and the real economy. And so the problem we're having is, and it's another problem with developing countries. I keep coming back with the developing country because this is where the problem is. They don't have venture capital in developing countries. It almost doesn't exist. It's a nascent thing. Even their capital market is very underdeveloped. And so to have that patient capital, where is it going to come from? It's going to have to come from pension fund, where a lot of the money is. It's going to have to come from the development banks, which that's their mandate. And then some sort of rulings. We saw people talk about blended finance. The first generation was not very successful. It basically didn't leverage any money from the private sector. The second generation is doing a bit better, but it was still not there. We still have to, by leveraging, I mean, your public money, we put public money and hope that it would attract private sector money. We're still too low. We need much more in those countries. So I think we have a financing for development program at the UN where we're actually working on this. But right now, the immediate thing is we need to solve the debt problem of those countries because they can't even invest in anything because they can't even import, they don't have enough money to import food. Look at Pakistan now. We have, so many countries that are already in debt distress, many others that are on the verge. And so if they default on their debt, they have no money. They're not going to invest in agriculture. They're not going to invest in energy, and they're going to be left behind. So I think the first priority is to help them solve that problem, and then find the public-private NGO, local university partnership that are needed to roll out these systems.
Barbara, what do you think? You guys, you're investing in companies. You tend to occasionally acquire companies. How do you think a company like Siemens can play a role in making sure that we continue to invest and change in the food system?
Well, there are a couple of things we can think about. One is business models themselves. One of the things that we're seeing as a trend is everything as a service. The idea that in the past you might have sold actual things to people, but now you might say, just as you do in software, I'm going to provide this as a service to you. So looking for ways to use other people's money, and allow someone to be able to consume as they require. I think we'll see new business models arising there. In the case of 80 Acres, I'll just use them as a case study again. One of our objectives with 80 Acres is to figure out what needs to be repeatable, packageable, what needs to be sort of shrink wrapped so that their solution could be licensed to others. Yes, they're making the heavy capital investment at the beginning, doing all the research, getting things settled into a process that can then be exported everywhere. So this concept of globalization, the idea of living on the edge, is really applicable here. Final comment is that if you listen to a lot of the financial analysts, money is moving. Money is moving to countries that are investing, yes, I agree with that. You look at the phenomenal investment being made in the United States today, that in and of itself is attracting plenty of private capital. It's that kind of assurance that investors are looking for to know that that the money they're bringing to the table will actually yield for them. But the second thing is now that money is migrating to real problems. And so, I think what investors are looking for is there a real need to be solved here? And therefore, what does the runway look like for this segment? And if we can continue to find companies that are well run, find ways to export their IP in ways that can be deployed globally, then we actually have a nicely developing market.
Right. Dave, I'd love to hear your perspective. I think you're on the early stage. You're incubating companies oftentimes. Yesterday in the Food Tech conference, we had Uma Valetti on stage. He raised $400 million last year, and he's creating a pilot plant to make cultivated meat. So very capital intensive technologies we're talking about in terms of new food tech. So I'd love to hear your perspective of like, how do we make sure we have the capital runways over 10-year, 20-year time horizon to make sure we can make the change?
It's a shit show right now. Like, these businesses that need to raise hundreds of millions of dollars are not going to raise them, and they're going to go bankrupt. So the reality is 90% plus of synthetic biology companies or these capital intensive, needing to scale tech companies that are trying to recreate some part of the food supply chain are not going to be able to access capital. This all shifted when interest rates shifted up, because the time horizon, the investment time horizon for capital allocators went from 15 plus years where we were all ultra optimistic and ESG oriented to like, holy shit, I can make 5% of my money by just buying US Treasury bonds. I'm only gonna make near-term high surety bets. Yep. And so the speculative bets, the capital intensive long range bets are completely out of the wheelhouse for the vast majority of capital providers that were writing big checks the last couple of years. So a lot of these companies built their business model on the premise that they would hit some proven unit economic potential and then raise a bunch of capital and scale it up. The reality is that that unit economic potential dictates a price in the market where you can actually make a positive gross profit that is much, 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 much higher than the alternative product that's already in the market. For example, selling a cultured meat for $1,000 a kilogram instead of $3 a kilogram. That's an extreme example, but very much more expensive, and it requires hundreds of millions of dollars. So what we've seen in the last couple of years with companies like Beyond Meat and so on is that consumers are only willing to pay a premium. Only a small number of consumers are willing to pay a premium. Sure, there'll be some novelty factor where people will try it out, but ultimately, if you want to hit the 90% of the world or 95% of the world, you have to make stuff that's cheaper than the alternative in order for the technology to actually play out. And that's not the case with almost all of these businesses today. Now, I think this is actually a good thing for the market and for the evolution of this opportunity over time. Because what it does is it now forces us to rethink all the other parts of the system and try and reinvent them so that they are cheaper, right? When Google started search, we were selling, I worked at Google when it was a private company. We used these Oracle servers. They cost $3,000 a server. And then we built our own server racks. And then we built our own commodity hardware, and we're like, this thing will last 6 months, and then we'll throw it out. And we got the cost of the server down to $150. We didn't even put a case on it. We used reusable power supplies and chips that we'd throw out. And we built an aircraft hangar to make this assembly line and make these servers. And I think that we need to see the same thing happen for these types of businesses to work. Because today, a lot of the synthetic biology companies are relying on biopharmaceutical grade equipment, which is mostly super, super expensive and used to make $3,000 a pill biological drugs. And that's not really going to scale as a food production alternative, as a commodity product alternative. So now we're being forced to the table to rethink. I think 95% of these companies will die, and the few that will survive are going to rethink, what's our focus? Can we actually beat the unit economic model for the commodity price in the market? And that's going to be a really interesting evolution over the next 5, 7, 10 years.
We have just a minute or so left. Barbara, just kind of ask you, what are you excited about in 2023 in terms of technology and a work towards helping kind of a broader set of people around the world be fed and exit food insecurity situations?
Well, what I'm excited about, I'll call it the biodiversity of ideas that are on the table right now. We do have a lot of creators right now working on this. And so we have many, many options to choose from.
Very, very good. What are you excited about, Chantalyn?
Well, come down and see the Human Security for All booth downstairs, and we'll tell you more about it. But I'm excited about the youth being much more aware of these issues than we were, and the fact that they see that we're heading in the cliff, and they're active, and they're going to force us. That we see it in the market. A lot of the money is being transferred to this generation, and they're not going to accept the way that we've been investing money without looking at the social and environmental issues, and it's going to help drive the market.
Dave, you excited about anything for this year?
I'm actually spending a bunch of time. We're going to close this deal this quarter in Brazil. We're bringing technology that's commonplace in developed markets to developing markets. We're doing a project, taking this company called Lavoro public, where the expectation is we can now introduce technology that's mainstay into these developing agricultural markets and see massive gains in yield and productivity and profitability for those farmers. And having been on the front lines and seen farmers use new tools, transform their livelihoods, transform their production potential, transform every acre that they farm, make more food, make more money, it's awesome to see. So that's something I'm spending time on right now, and we're pretty excited about it. It's an easy no-brainer. It's like
Well, we're out of time. I want to say thank you to the panelists. I want to thank CES and CTA for bringing this issue onto the stage. I've always felt that CES is where a lot of times conversations start, and then they go and propagate throughout the year into important places like the United Nations and conferences around the world. So I'm really happy we're addressing these issues. There's an urgency to these issues, so thank you for having us. And give a big round of applause to these panelists.
Thank you.